Hello. Money is a kind of poetry, Wallace Stevens wrote in Adagia, his collection of aphoristic reflections. Stevens was a Harvard-trained lawyer and rose over his working life to become vice president of a large insurance company. Poets need money to live, but is money itself a fertile subject for poetry? In this episode of Poetry and the Turning World, we're going to look at poems that are, in one way or another, about the complexities of finance and debt, wealth and poverty, and also how money itself becomes a metaphor for the often broken relations we hold with ourselves, others, and society. Poetry and money are, after all, both systems of symbols and of collective imagining. Are poems themselves a kind of currency, as in these lines from the pre-Raphaelite Dante Gabriel Rossetti? A sonnet is a coin, its face reveals the soul, its converse to what power 'tis due. For Rossetti, the sonnet form, words poured into a mould, flipping on a volta, is like a coin that pays the way to immortality. In her Pulitzer Prize-winning Frank sonnets, Diane Seuss tossed the metaphor to land the other way. For her, the sonnet, like poverty, teaches you what you can do without. My name is Sarah Howe, and I'm a poet, critic, and editor, and I'm as ever talking to poet, critic, and professor of English at Cornell University, Sandeep Parmar.
Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Sandeep.
I wanted to go back to the Wallace Stevens quote from Adagia, that really kind of fascinating book of aphorisms, really, which is money is a kind of poetry. And this aphorism gets used kind of quite a lot and recycled by various people, but even
circulates.
It circulates, yes, exactly. It has a kind of exchange value, and in a way, I suppose the aphorism, which this book is a sort of series of aphorisms, often contradictory, which is very interesting. It is a very long Stevens poem, which is a kind of cumulative poem, isn't it? And we'll be thinking about accumulation and cumulative poems as we talk about other poets in relation to money. But the aphorism itself has a kind of truthfulness, right? It's a kind of phrase that can be given, that can be exchanged, that is meant to deliver something that is sort of discrete, almost like money. And so who are some of the other people who take this Stevens quote?
Well, it crops up in all sorts of places, prose and poetry. So it sort of lets Ben Lerner launch off on a new section of his argument in his The Hatred of Poetry, his sort of essay on the power and the sort of negative light in which the power of poetry is often cast. Except he gets it the wrong way around. He flips it to poetry as a kind of money. He misremembers in an instructive and illustrative way before launching off on a really quite interesting meditation on poetry and circulation of capital and what it feels like to be a consumer in those networks. Fellow American poet Kay Ryan also flips it round, and she has a poem that begins, "Poetry is a kind of money whose value depends upon reserves." That's interesting, isn't it?
It is, because I guess there is, we'll be thinking about this a lot, the kind of spectral nature of money, particularly of like kind of the bill as a form of money, which is representative of something else. Money as a bill or even as a coin has a reserve from which it is drawing its value and otherwise is meaningless. And this, of course, happens when we get inflation and various other kinds of economic disturbances. But it's interesting to reverse that simile, isn't it? That poetry is a kind of money. I'm not sure which way I like it better, actually, but I think either way, it draws a really interesting parallel between these two, as you say, kind of metaphorical and symbolic things that produce and depend on other, often unseen forces.
I think reserves is interesting there too, and sort of a pun also, that poetry is something that holds something back often, and, well, money in a different way the same, that it both depend upon a sort of withholding, a sort of scarcity even?
Yes, I suppose. You wouldn't want to kind of, I guess, flood in the way, if we think about kind of prose as a different matter, poetry is a concise form. And in its concision, it is holding back, it is reserving. So in that case, absolutely. And the metaphor, the simile, is there to stand in for something that is much larger. And of course, what we do in close readings is to draw on those reserves and to think about what lies behind, what stands behind language. And so in that way, it is very appropriate. And Stevens has another interesting aphorism in Adagia, which is happiness is an acquisition, which asks all sorts of questions of us, really. What is one acquiring with happiness, and how does one acquire happiness? Is it through some kind of monetary gain? Because, of course, what do we know of Stevens? Well, he was, certainly someone who thought a lot about money.
Well, I guess he did know some financial hardship, though he had grown up the son of a relatively wealthy lawyer. But I guess his dad had some financial straits when he was at Harvard, actually, and he had to withdraw.
Yeah.
And he did spend some time wafting around trying to be a freelance writer before resolving that he did need to go to law school after all. But famously, he bought his house in Hartford, Connecticut without a mortgage outright, didn't he? So
lucky him.
But he sort of put in the hard graft at the insurance company in order to have the freedom of imagination in his writerly life, didn't he? Money is a Kind of Poetry is the epigraph to yet another poem by Dana Gioia, isn't it? And that's the opposite vision of from scarcity and reserve to the sort of compounding plenitude of money as this thing that grows and grows. So money breeds money, gathering interest, compounding daily, always in circulation. Money, you don't know where it's been, but you put it where your mouth is and it talks.
That's so wonderful, isn't it? And it feels so visceral in this construction from Dana Gioia. But I think there is a kind of distrust almost running through some of these interpretations as well. And I wonder if that distrust of money and its spectrality and its sort of the ability to kind of gain or lose it in ways, I wonder what that makes us think about how we feel about trusting poetry or trusting the language or the word as something that feels slippery or that it's kind of going to escape us in some way.
Well, trust being another financial metaphor.
Right.
And the sort of abstraction and spectrality of today's financial markets makes them sort of feel no less imaginary than certain poems in a way, doesn't it? And also sort of tracking the fluctuations of human emotion in the way that
absolutely.
we might associate with the currents of a poem.
Poetry is a kind of market, yes, that goes up and goes down. The bull and the bear market somehow in poetry.
And in that market, how much is a poem worth, Sandy?
Well, I guess it depends on who's paying. But certainly, I mean, we've talked about this before with kind of poetry and work, that poets don't tend to make a lot of money on their poems in the kind of real world sense. But poems, they gain value over time. I mean, they accrue value, certainly if they become kind of canonical in some way. Or even if they are mysterious and then suddenly found, like some sort of lost, buried treasure. There is a sense of that too, of the poem. I mean, there was a Virginia Woolf poem that was recently discovered, and you sort of think, oh, that has a lot of value, actually, which is a kind of association value. But
well, and the aura of the manuscript, I suppose.
Absolutely.
We are going to clean up when we sell our notebooks and WhatsApp logs to a university library somewhere.
One hopes that would be the case.
That's the plan.
Yes. And we should also note that there is a significant kind of strain of contemporary, particularly contemporary avant-garde poetic practice, but also just in the ways that the avant-garde develops over the 20th century, which is a distrust of the commodity value of art, a distrust of the commodity value of poetry. And so you get in the kind of post-war period in Britain and America this reversion away from the kind of more professional or more market-driven production of poetry into something that is handmade, hand-distributed, that tries to as a gift, exactly, or as a kind of part of a coterie. It's sort of it's different in a way than the way you get kind of avant-garde literary magazines or little magazines in the early 20th century. But just to think about the modes of production and how money is tied up in those things is also very interesting. But the avant-garde, in trying to kind of, eschew this mass market of poetry, ironically, some of those things are now very, very valuable because they are so ephemeral. And ephemerality then becomes this way of thinking about poetic value.
So yeah, how much is a poem worth? About $10.99 for circa 64 pages, or it's priceless. It's an art form that sort of thinks of itself as resisting commodification. And I think Patricia Lockwood is poking fun at this when she says the ode on a Grecian urn is worth any number of old ladies hung from a cliff. It reminds me of a joke my dad used to tell, which goes something like, "What's a Grecian urn? 50 bob a week." Audre Lorde, sort of, well, is she idealizing poetry in her essay Age, Race, Class and Sex when she talks of it as being, of all the art forms, the most economical?
Well, I guess it goes back to our question of what economical means in this case, right? So it's either something that is easy to produce because one only theoretically needs pen and paper to do so, but also it's economical in the sense of its concision of language. So there's kind of both, I'm sure, in Lorde's thinking. But the question of physical labor and of materiality is something that, and also just where you can do it. You can produce it anywhere. Lorde says, scraps of surplus paper in the hospital pantry, on the subway. So it doesn't become like other art forms, a place where you have to have a particularly designated space for it, like a studio or whatever. And, for Lorde, she's particularly interested in the intersections between, as the title suggests, class and also race and the accessibility and sex and the accessibility of poetry to all sorts of different people and all sorts of different experiences.
She thinks of it as an art form that has a sort of lower bar to entry, doesn't she? Because you don't need to shell out for materials or space in the same way. I mean, some might argue against that.
Yes.
It takes certain kinds of privilege and education to write or indeed read a work like the Cantos, which we will come on to at some point.
Well, and I suppose we have to go back again, bringing up Virginia Woolf, and we have to go back to the kind of the famous her famous lecture, which became a publication, A Room of One's Own, in which she says, you need a certain amount of money, it was £250, a year or whatever, to write, and a space in a room of one's own, and this gets taken up laterally by feminist writers. Adrienne Rich, in When We Did Awaken, thinks about this and the reality of that in I think Rich's essays in the 1970s, and Alice Walker also in Search of Our Mother's Gardens responds to kind of Woolf's sort of famous statement of what one needs to be a writer, and I think it thinks about artistic production in different ways and the value of that and the way that it can be monetized or commodified. So I suppose, there is perhaps a slightly utopian ideal of poetry being accessible in Lorde's thinking, but also quite, I think, quite useful and in some cases true.
I don't know if she specifically had her in mind, but Lorde's mention in that essay of the hospital pantry as a site where poetry could be written did make my mind flit to a figure like Lorin Niedecker, who is a generation after Pound, I suppose, is particularly associated with the objectivists. But she lived through the Great Depression, as a few of the poets we've been talking about did. But her first book of poems, New Goose, published in 1946, it's these sort of modern fairy tales of financial hardship and endurance coming out of the Depression. So one of those poems, Depression Years, the speaker is wondering if his daughters should support him, but they're not out of debt from the last time they did. She writes all the time about money and debt and financial precarity, and was precariously employed herself for much of her life, and in her 50s found herself working in a hospital pantry. She was a cleaner in a hospital, but there's only one poem of hers, a teeny little thing that sort of records those years of hard graft. It's called Hospital Kitchen, and including the title, it's 11 words long. Return the night women's gravy to the cleaned stove.
Such an incredible image, really, isn't it? A kind of image complex, I guess. What do we make of the night women's gravy?
Well, gravy, slang for money. We'll see various sorts of slang for money coming up today. Money does metaphorize itself in this way. But do we know the origins of this phrase? It's from the 1920s or so, isn't it?
Yeah, a gravy train, apparently from 1920s American railroad workers, to describe the kind of short or easy railway run. And so the gravy train was something that was kind of, I don't know, it was a bit like cheating, really. It was like taking the gravy train. It's like somehow taking the shortcut to something that's, otherwise would take a kind of great deal of time. And so that possibly is the way we think about gravy. But
easy money.
Yeah.
So, in like contemporary political discourse, it's like a junket, politicians taking taxpayers for a ride or something.
Well, yes, indeed. But I mean, gravy more broadly, I'm just thinking of, isn't there an O'Hara poem where he had the phrase that sheer gravy comes up and you just think, oh, that must be good. Gravy must be really excellent. And it is kind of like an overflowing of, I don't know, it feels quite excessive somehow,
It's
gravy.
the luxury that goes on top of the basic meal, isn't it? And I suppose it's the one pleasure maybe of these working women, whether they're the cleaning ladies, the fellow cleaning ladies, or the nurses who've been on the night shift, and then Niedecker comes in the morning and scrubs the stove underneath the pot where the cooling gravy is congealing. One of her most famous poems, Poet's Work, sort of uses a similar image of condensing, doesn't she? Because she talks about the poet sitting at their desk, no layoff from this condensery, which I guess is an image that points to like the dairies of her native Wisconsin and condensing milk into, condensed milk and concentrating it, boiling it down to this sweetness.
Which also makes it something that can be, kind of sustained for longer, right? So in a sense, and it's not something that I would necessarily associate with luxury in a way. It's almost comes like a staple necessity. It's like if you can't have fresh milk, you have condensed milk. And condensed milk gets taken up in all sorts of kind of dishes in which one, needs something that is concentrated for whatever reason, not being able to have the time to put into doing it oneself. So it feels kind of cheap as well at the same time. And maybe that's how we feel about gravy now. I don't know. This is back to Mr. Bleaney and the preference of sauce and gravy. And I always get a bit flummoxed, but I think which is better?
I mean, Niedecker does write around this time that the hospital put up their wages by 15 cents, but then they half of that goes towards the meals they used to give them for free. So I wonder if there is a sort of bitter irony to this gravy that used to be part of the remuneration package and no longer. And Niedecker was very interested in workers' rights and unionization, which, as Kristen Grogan has pointed out, were sort of a particular thing associated with Wisconsin at this time after the Depression.
Yeah. I mean, the Depression and certainly the fluctuations in the economy in the mid-20th century, early mid-20th century had a huge impact on so many of the poets that came up during that time. And I guess we would be amiss not to talk about Ezra Pound, wouldn't we?
Whose dictum condensare Niedecker probably has in mind, but it gives rise to an imagistic short poem, which the cantos certainly is not, is it?
It's true. I mean, I guess going back to imagism in the early 20th century, that was it was sort of along the lines of Pound and, of course, and Flint and others who were in HD, who were interested in kind of could be seen as imagist poets, of a really intense condensation of a poem, whereas poetry of the 19th century had been kind of long lines and narrative and epic and all this sort of stuff. What we get here are these extremely condensed poems, economical poems in many ways.
A bit like Diane Zeus on her sonnet teaching you what you can do without, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And apparently we can do without quite a lot. And Pounds had many dictas, and he said, use no superfluous word and go in fear of abstractions and all that other stuff. So, but in terms of economics, in terms of money, Pound is fascinated by money. And he apparently becomes really, really interested in this at around 1919. Peter Nichols, the modernist scholar, writes about this. That Pound has a sudden turn in 1919 because he reads a serialized version of a book, which is a wild ride. I did have a look, by C.H. Douglas called Economic Democracy. It was serialized in the New Age, so a magazine at the time. And Douglas's thinking is really about the kind of disparity between prices of things and purchasing power. So the kind of underlying economic, sort of warring economic ideas at the time emerge from the founding of America. So we have these kind of the duels of the founding, literally the duels of the founding fathers with the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, what comes to be known as kind of Jeffersonianism or Jeffersonian democracy or Jeffersonian economics, and the more federalist views of Alexander Hamilton, who many people will know about for other reasons. But Jeffersonianism is a focus, it's what Pound was particularly interested in. And it's a focus kind of around a sort of agrarian society, the idea that one should be kind of attached to the products of one's labor. But it's really interesting and notable for what it is against. It's against kind of international and financial institutions. It's against national banks. It's kind of just sort of against any way of kind of controlling the circulation of money. And there's a really interesting book about this by Alec Marsh, the Pound scholar, where he talks about both Pound and William Carlos Williams and their interest in Jeffersonianism because it is distributionist. It wants to broaden the access to money by increasing money's quantity or increasing the velocity of its circulation. So this is very different than Hamiltonian thinking, which favors credit and limiting access to exchange. So just this kind of thinking around Jeffersonianism as a critique of capitalism, a critique of market capitalism specifically, but also a real distrust of the arbitrary measure of value that money provides. And so this kind of these economic theories are abounding in Pound's thinking, and he writes the cantos. The early cantos are kind of very much drawn or an interest to try to locate what is really going wrong in the early 20th century between two wars, and we have the Great Depression, etc. But it should be said, the cantos is a very long poem. It's 109 odd sections, some fragments, and it was written between 1915 and 1962. And Pound famously said about the cantos that it was a poem with history. So it is full of history, and it covers a range of subjects and includes Chinese characters very controversially and lots of other things. But it is interested in global finance, and it does take aim at global finance.
He does have a slightly idiosyncratic take on economics, shall we say?
Well, I think he was either a pragmatist or a kind of dilettante when it came to certain things. And often his views are contradictory. And I suppose if you're going to write a poem over, 50 years or whatever, you're bound to have changed your mind, especially given the length of time, and what happens between these kind of endpoints. But we can listen to, because Pound's delivery is also fantastic, but we're going to listen to a snippet of the canto that I think is probably most interesting to us in relation to money, which is Canto 45, which is called With Usura.
Usura rusteth the chisel, it rusteth the craft and the craftsman, it gnaweth the thread in the loom, none learneth to weave gold in her pattern.
So what is usura?
What is usura? Usura becomes this kind of a feminine embodiment of usury. And so we have a note from Pound at the bottom of the poem where he says, usury, a charge for the use of purchasing power levied without regard to production, often without regard to the possibilities of production, parentheses, hence the failure of the Medici Bank. A fact I did not know. But basically, usury is interest, isn't it? It's a very old form of interest. It feels kind of biblical, kind of in its origins. And Pound is very much against it.
Well, and I suppose he's coming from a good place in as much as his desire is essentially for social justice and redistribution, isn't it? But I guess this is part where his anti-Semitism comes in part, and he sort of turns to fascism, wrong-headedly believing that it will enact his economic ideas about doing away with interest.
This is where these things become muddled. But I mean, fundamentally, Pound was against kind of expansionism and felt that expansionism would lead to kind of global conflict, which he wasn't in some ways wrong about that. And obviously, there's this fear of imperialism, et cetera, underlying all of this. But it's interesting with the Usura poem because he really is going back to craft, to the connection between kind of, man and what he produces. So we have, usury comes in as being this just terrible evil that destroys the product in the hands of the craftsman. So rusting the chisel, gnawing the thread from the loom, rusting the craft and the craftsman. So usury is really antithetical to moral production, and to the equivalent somehow within Jeffersonianism of virtue and labor, and the opposite of virtue, and kind of evil being associated with forms of capital that become divorced from any kind of human hand or any kind of human sense of worth. So the flow of credit is kind of antisocial in some ways. And Pound has a really interesting quote where he really kind of goes in hard on usury and says, and as a kind of aesthetic corruption, he says, "You can probably date any Western work of art by reference to the ethical estimate of usury prevalent at the time of that work's composition. The greater the component of tolerance for usury, the more blobby and messy the work of art. The kind of thought which distinguishes good from evil down to the details of commerce rises into the quality of line in paintings and into the clear definition of the word written." You can't really put it better than Pound in that case. The kind of the moral corruption of art is.
And that leads nicely to the first poem that we'll look at today. Though all three, in various ways, are interested in the morality or amorality of money and financial markets, aren't they?
Indeed. Our poem from the archive this episode is by Frederick Seidel in late December, first published in the LRB in December 2016. The poem later appeared in Seidel's collection Peaches Goes It Alone, which came out with Faber in 2019. Frederick Seidel is the author of numerous collections of poetry, including Ooga Booga in 2006, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and Going Fast, which came out in 1998, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. Seidel's work is often controversial, and there's a kind of sense of people kind of either really kind of loving or feeling kind of uncomfortable, I suppose, by Seidel's poetry. And there's often a kind of focus, really, with Seidel's work on his wealth. He talks about wealth and is wealthy. And his interest in Italian motorcycles, Ducati motorcycles particularly, and his famous friends with whom he's associated. In a profile of Seidel in The Nation, Robin Cresswell writes, "He is not a satirist, though he can be very wicked, and the comedy of his poems is not the comedy of manners. Instead, it is more desperate, more affecting comedy of belatedness, in which the poet finds that his voice is only an accent, and that all accents are only echoes."
In late December, for Mitzi Angel. The man using the payphone on Wall Street, his back to you, is using it as a urinal. And urinating, only logical. Our degradation is complete. The young woman, a crazy smile pickled in brine, cross-legged on the sidewalk in a T-shirt that says tomorrow, holds a sign telling her sad story. She's reading a paperback of Lolita, stealthily, behind the sign. She could be you. Stranger things have turned out to be true. He could be me. Don't rule out the possibility. This shirt sleeves Christmas weather is lovely and seriously weird. El Niño is how Jesus was. Both changed the climate. Everyone will have a home. Everyone is safe and warm. The homeless sleep on a bed of roses and sip ice wine, German Eiswein. They spend their time deciding where they want to dine. They spend the rest of their time thinking about the sublime and exhuming corpses so they don't have to beg for a living from the living. They bring back billions of bodies and pile them in the apartment building lobbies and repopulate the financial world with the dead, like a dog bringing back a stick. The stick is what was underground, back in sunlight. Cadavers and cremains hump on walkers down Wall Street, and a homeless hand reaches out to them for baksheesh. She could be you. Stranger things have turned out to be true. He could be me. I don't discount the possibility. Jews, Christians, Muslims, others. It's Christmas morn. Aloha, amici. Christ is born. Flowers are fooled into thinking it's spring. The little city birds sing.
Wow.
Yeah.
So Seidel immediately puts this poem and situates us at the symbolic centre of global capitalism, doesn't he, with that payphone on Wall Street and the homeless man urinating into it. And it's hyperbolic, I suppose, that our degradation is complete, deliberately so. But I think maybe that hour is the most interesting thing about that line. Like, what collectivity does it represent?
I suppose in a way the poem kind of, is interested in inequality, obviously. But you're right that in the hour, what's happening is we're all being drawn together as a kind of common humanity. And that is, I suppose, in a way, what the poem is kind of appealing to. It is somewhat unclear, but I guess the unifying of humanity within kind of common need and purpose is circulating around various things, whether that's, food, the need to urinate, or the fact that money affects us in all different ways. And yet somehow we are exchangeable for each other, in a sense.
Yes, I think it is speaking to some sort of larger humanity, though I guess there are various pairings as well in the poem. That the R is the man and his wife, Mitzi Angel of the epigraph, the wealthy speaker contrasted with the homeless man.
Could be.
But I guess our might be, all those bound up in capitalism at large, as you say.
I wonder about that is because of the refrain, right? We have these two stanzas that appear in slightly different formulations. That are repeated from the beginning and towards the end with a she could be you, stranger things have turned out to be true, he could be me, don't rule out that possibility. When it comes back as the penultimate stanza, we have an exclamation mark after she could be you, almost incredulous, which is interesting. And
I read it as sort of camped up, that exclamation mark in the recurrence.
Yeah. In the sense that, I guess that there's a kind of performance in some way of empathy. Is that the campness?
Well, I mean, this goes to the heart of the difficulty and complexity of this poem, this question of what is the tone. And I think that is the main traction and interest of Seidel's work, isn't it? What is his stance and what is the tonality? Is this sort of empathy and a vision of our shared humanity, or is this all rather tongue-in-cheek with a twinkle, edgelord style?
Yes.
I think that it's probably both. I have to say that I was quite fascinated and surprised by the way that Seidel voices the poem in the recording we've just heard.
Yes. I thought it would be much cheekier.
Yeah, me too. I mean, there is a bit of a twinkle, including in that refrain, but there's also more gravitas and sort of pathos to the way he speaks it than I was expecting.
It's quite even the way that he's reading it, almost as though it's not unempathetic, it's just kind of not affective in any kind of way. There's a sort of like neutrality, isn't there? Kind of, in the way that it's being spoken, which I suppose is a kind of leveling or a kind of absence of judgment. But this is one of the things, of course, that makes people very uncomfortable about Seidel's work, is that some of the poems are almost, Dan Chasen writes in the New York Review of Books that Seidel's a ruthless poet, almost gleefully deficient in empathy. And I don't think we're feeling the glee necessarily in this poem, or though I think it probably does exist elsewhere. But I think we feel uncomfortable, particularly now, when inequality is so stark, when some of the other questions that Seidel's writing about, which are often very political questions, when one doesn't take a very clear stance. And I think it tells us more about ourselves, maybe, in reading these poems, than maybe it does about what we think Seidel is thinking. And Seidel's, kind of in various interviews sort of maybe not been particularly interested in that question himself, but...
Well, I mean, some might say that it's the position of the bourgeois late capitalist not to be able to, especially the left-leaning one, not to be able to take a clear stance on these things. I guess this poem, the book before this, the book that this poem features in, the Peaches volume, was called Widening Income Inequality of 2016. And the title poem of that book, I think it does show the glee. Yes. And also the recurring fascination with have-nots and the contrast between Seidel as the wealthy diner out and the starving homeless. Here are a few lines from the opening of that piece. I live a life of appetite, and yes, that's right, I live a life of privilege in New York, eating buttered toast in bed with cunty fingers on Sunday morning. Say that again? I have a rule. I never give to beggars in the street who hold their hands out.
It's brutal, isn't it? I mean, in so many ways. And I guess
but also performative, as you say.
Yes. And I think the acknowledgement of sort of saying I live a life of privilege is quite a bold statement because poets, well, many people, I think, avoid saying such things when it is clearly in evidence that there is, of course, privilege there. So we're more likely to try to kind of point to our hard knocks than we are to our whatever privilege we have. So there's something kind of almost overly authentic, I guess, or at least brutally honest anyway about this. There's an interview with Seidel where he's asked, this is from Wild Court, he's asked, do you worry about being so offensive? And he kind of, he leans back in his chair and he's kind of worried and thoughtful and says, no. Do you care about who you offend? He's asked. And he says, I don't care about who I offend. I just publish them. And I think that that's kind of, again, a very interesting stance that the poet doesn't have to stand behind or endorse a poem. Doesn't have to be the reserves, doesn't have to represent in any way what the poem necessarily is giving us. And yet there is a lot here to say, I think, about human relations and how we depend, whether we want to or not, on each other. And there's some really very frightening images from this poem, aren't there, to do with the undead, I think. Is that right?
Well, I guess the last 2/3 of the poem launch off on this reverie, don't they, which gets excessively more absurd. So it begins with this vision of the homeless and this sort of mock utopian declaration, everyone will have a home, everyone is safe and warm, and patently untrue that the homeless sleep on a bed of roses and sip ice wine is sort of blasphemous, isn't it? Grotesque, actually. Spending their time deciding where they want to dine and their time thinking about the sublime. I wonder if that's a jibe at the privileged academics that have the time to do such thinking in their ivory towers. But then it does move on to this vision of the undead. Is it like a sort of resurrection of the dead, like a doom in a medieval church in some ways?
Well, we do have Christ being born there at the end. I mean, Christ returning is possibly the image we're meant to take from this. But it does feel as though that we're in a kind of zombie film.
Yes, it's also a zombie flick. Actually, Colson Whitehead's 2012 novel Zone 1 sort of riffs off that genre also, doesn't he? Yes. And it's set in the financial district of New York City. Yeah. And he has this character looking across the water to the Statue of Liberty and thinking, give me your poor, your hungry, your suppurating masses yearning to eat, which I guess is doing a similar extrapolation of thinking of the haves and the have-nots as the undifferentiated undead hordes. But I think it's also a point about corporate zombies being undead already. I guess this was post-financial crash in 2008, isn't it?
Yeah, and also happening in Lower Manhattan, which, of course, becomes a kind of burial site in the aftermath of September the 11th. So there is a kind of association there with the felling of the World Trade Center and a hub, a symbol of global capitalism, and the ways in which the kind of the dead then come to represent those people who are taken up by this system and who are a part of this system. And that's also kind of, both kind of fascinating and also, quite frightening as well at the same time.
It might also be a more specific reference. This poem's published in the LRB in 2016. It seems in 2013, Occupy protesters literally dressed as zombies, didn't they? So
yes, indeed.
they staged a demonstration as corporate zombies on Wall Street. One spokesman for the group said protesters should eat monopoly money while in their zombie attire to let financial workers see us reflecting the metaphor of their actions.
Yeah. I mean, do we need to dig into what zombies actually are? Zombies are the undead who eat the undead? Is that how it works? I don't watch zombie movies.
Well, actually, this is all reminding me of a wonderful piece Thomas Jones wrote in the LRB around this time. I think ostensibly a review of Colson Whitehead's novel, where he sort of talks about the malleability of the them and us of the zombie metaphor, that, for example, is not straightforwardly racialized because the locus classicus of the genre Night of the Living Dead sort of puts a black hero at the center of things. And so it's very easy to flip that us and them depending on where your sympathies lie, that the zombies are the everyone else, depending where you stand.
It feels like no one is escaping the zombies at this point. We're basically kind of either well-off or not very well-off zombies, really, in the poem. It's interesting just to go back to that refrain and the change here and maybe this is something we can kind of draw out, kind of what Seidel is getting at here. This she could be you, he could be me bit. The last line of that quatrain at first is don't rule out the possibility. It becomes I don't discount the possibility. So having started with the hour, we go to the I and the word discount, which is, of course, kind of monetarily very interesting in terms of money. I mean, it could almost be I don't discredit it either. And it's interesting how we think about the kind of negation of that. But also the sense of putting the self in there really at the end, whereas don't rule out the possibility feels like a kind of saying to someone else, well, it could happen to you, and then become to, it could happen to me. And maybe that is the fear of having lots of money, is the fear of always losing it.
This is an anxiety poem where the zombie metaphor writes that large. I mean, at this time, I think the media was abounding with zombie financial metaphors, wasn't it? Zombie banks, zombie debt. Yes. A few years later, zombie mortgages. But this idea of capital as a sort of cannibalistic closed cycle, I suppose, feeding on itself. But there's Eliot here too, isn't there?
Yes.
That I think in the hordes of the dead, the unreal city from the burial of the dead in the first section of The Wasteland, I had not thought death had undone so many, goes that line, as he watches the crowd flowing over London Bridge. So doing this sort of corporate work in the financial district is sort of the fate of the living dead in a way.
Yeah, and I mean, for Eliot, I suppose, in a way, that's an image of also those who have kind of died in war as well, who are coming back, and also this sort of the overflowing city of dreams that we get from Baudelaire, and from, I think it's Seven Old Men, isn't it? The kind of the influence there in Unreal City, but the overflowing of death, or the inability to stave off death, also with money or with wealth, and death is the great equalizer in this case, and I think there is, yes, again, some anxiety about that. But even the phrase widening income inequality, it's almost like you read it as sort of like he's endorsing it somehow. It's like a verb, we should widen it. But then you think, well, it's actually a thing, isn't it? That it's income inequality is widening. And I think that it's those sorts of plays, really, in the phrasing of this poem and elsewhere, that makes us both uncomfortable, but also returns us to a kind of more honest and accountable, if I'm going to use another slightly monetary word, gives us an accountability, really, for our own positions, which is interesting.
Chasen in that NYRB piece traces this all back to Seidel's privileged childhood in St. Louis and the fact that his family had this business delivering coal, which did very well, and they owned a coal mine. And so in his heretically titled first collection, Final Solutions, Seidel writes in the voice of a coal boss, the poem's called The Coal Man, who is imagining the company's African-American customers, though that's not the epithet he uses, eating our soft coal whole and vomiting slick eels of blackness. I can see this. And Chasen's reading of this is, and I quote here, Seidel never got over the fact that remote misery could be laundered into money and converted into the pleasing objects of his prosperous childhood. It's made him an expert on two things, luxury objects and human pain. So one might say that this poet of the unbridled id is actually in some ways a sort of taking, I don't know, a horrific but, I don't know, a curiously moral stance on these things, though it's not satire in the conventional, traditional vein of offering a moral corrective, I suppose.
But it is interesting. It kind of takes us back to the point, really, from Pound, that somehow thinking about money is thinking about virtue and morality, which is odd because, in some ways we think that money takes us further away from those ideals. But again, it's situated within some of the founding questions, within America, which is about kind of how much one controls capital, how much one controls access to money, how money changes or kind of reorganizes or establishes America as a state. After its independence from Britain, and what that becomes, obviously, is this global hub for finance and a kind of a different sort of imperialism.
Our next poem we'll look at today moves across the Atlantic to think about the challenges facing Generation Rent, but the motif of the undead and money as death rears its head again. Next up is Ella Frears, a poet and artist originally from Cornwall but now based in London. Her debut collection, Shine Darling, was shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best First Collection and the T.S. Eliot Prize. Her follow-up, Good Lord, from which this extract comes, came out in 2024. It's a hybrid work which takes the form of one long rant of an email to an estate agent. As The Guardian put it, Good Lord offers a flash of insight into the darkest corners of Generation Rent. The tone of this poem is sort of flirtatious, unhinged and plangent by turns, and the pretext of the email becomes a container for this sprawling stream of consciousness odyssey through the narrator's life, linked by places and spaces of habitation and of work. But what links the episodes is this string of depressing, mould-spattered rental properties in which the young tenant has lived. And the whole action is propelled by her desire for a home or even a rental property with a door that will close. Meanwhile, the property market entrenching inequality is a nightmarish hydra that regenerates even as we try to pierce it. And so the extract we'll look at is from the opening of this book-length poem, and the epigraph here sets the scene. Ava, the estate agent, has sent through a request that the tenant sign up with Good Lord, a third-party platform for managing letting agreements. So here's the epigraph. We're delighted to be renewing your tenancy. We've partnered with Good Lord, a property technology company, so you can sign your renewal contract online. To get started, you'll need to set up an account with Good Lord. Ava, Nestor Estate Agents. Dear Ava, it's not your fault that this caught me like it did. Good Lord, the name disturbs me most, as though we're meant to pledge ourselves to call our faceless landlord good or God, and I should I, feel graced or blessed to live under this roof? Oh, Ava, I was snagged on it. To tell the truth, a thread came loose. I should explain. Picture me in this little flat you rent us, lips parted, blowing my coffee's meniscus into waves. Soft at first, then crashing up the mug's insides and over. Yes, the sheets will surely stain. And I was thinking of the old gods, Ava, and ships they sank without notice, without malice. I was reading an article, just the top, peeking over the paywall, the surface foam of current events lifted with a teaspoon. The surface is where the art is, I said. Not everything's like coffee, he replied. I like my men bitter. It's been a while since we did have thrush, a pox on both our crotches. See, Ava, the article spoke of basements being built across the city. They can't go up, and so they dig. I think that was the gist, but what intrigued me most was the idea that once they'd dug, 3 floors down? The digger was too big to get back out. Cheaper then, it said, to dig a little grave and bury it there. Imagine, thousands of diggers entombed across the city. You must have many questions, but I only read the tip of it. It struck me, though, and I thought about the summer's day a surveyor friend, more than friend, let me climb into a digger's little cab and pull the earth from deep inside a trench. A thrill. Perhaps you've also tried. I made a joke, a good one, about burying a body. Then my phone rang. My uncle had died. All those diggers sealed in concrete, underground. So sad. And then your email, Ava. And though it was a Sunday, that soft buzz is like a siren's call. I couldn't help but tap the icon. I was in bed. Did I mention that? Lazy, you might think, but I'd had this dream.
It's such an interesting book, and you gave us a kind of sense of the book as a whole there, thinking about the kind of the episodic and the ways in which this is kind of framing itself as a sort of, I guess, a kind of complaint or thinking around complaint, which is also very interesting. But I guess to have this almost faceless relation with someone who controls where one lives, the flow of one's money is a step beyond really where we've been, I think. There is no touch exchange. There is no beggar's hand being extended here. This is completely devoid of human connection, which makes it so much worse.
And the technological portal is sort of furthering that, isn't it? There's a passage later on where the speaker riffs again on this idea of the landlord as the good lord or God. And it talks about them never being given the landlord's name, which is withheld a bit like the name of God.
Yes. And I guess is often the case, right? But I suppose because of the fear of, I don't know, some kind of knowing who your lord is, to whom you are, I guess kind of feudally connected. But there's an interesting, I guess, kind of question around form here, not just in the kind of complaint, but in the kind of epistolary form, in the form of email in this case, not actually handwritten letters. And I mean, I suppose this is a part of a tradition of epistolary poems that we can date back to Ovid, to the Heroides, to Horace's Odes, to Alexander Pope, and some of his contemporaries, and possibly even thinking about a kind of connection to dramatic monologue in the 19th century. How do you read the epistolary side of this, of the book?
Well, I think there's something interesting happening with Ava. So Ava recurs, it's threaded through as the addressee. We might note in passing that her name is a palindrome, isn't it? A bit like Ella is. And there's something going on here about mirroring. Yeah. But it's not clear whether they've met in person at all. But at one point, the speaker looks up Ava and realizes she's 20 or 21, so younger than her. So there's a sort of stalkerish relation. I think there's something happening with over proximity and distance, which feeds into the sort of confessionalism. I don't think that's the right word at all. But this idea of privacy, the rental room whose door won't close. There's a sense that the rental subject, the tenant, has no privacy, and so she might as well splurge. But also a parody of email as a sort of write-only form. That it's almost like she's able to recount what becomes some of the worst and darkest episodes of her life to this faceless Ava because there's no sense in which she will ever reply.
Yeah.
So the tenant sort of sends endless emails asking for the sink to be fixed and the mould dealt with, and Ava never replies. And then this email about signing up to Good Lord comes through, and that's sort of the final straw.
Yeah, and it's so gleeful, isn't it? We're delighted to be renewing your tenancy. And you don't even actually sign it physically anymore, these contracts. They're all done virtually. There's the absence of human touch even there.
That hollow politeness of service language, yeah.
I know. I really thought Ava was a chatbot, but apparently Ava's real. But there's also an interesting, and you kind of referenced it in the beginning there, where you were talking about the kind of odyssey of this journey through the kind of various sort of trials, if you like, of rental properties. And there is a kind of Homeric strain
there
here,
is
there?
there not?
With the epigraph, Ava works for a company called Nestor Estate Agents. And with Nestor, we think of the King of Pylos, who
we all,
of course,
the King of Pylos.
And I feel Nestor and Mentor, they're all there. But Nestor was. He's someone who kind of takes in Telemachus, Odysseus' son, and recounts, among the many people who are recounting at this point what happens before or during the Trojan War and etc. and the attempts there afterwards to get back. And but also Nestor is sort of he's chastised at one point or kind of pilloried for being overly hospitable. So it's interesting to think about Nestor as this like hospitable king, and yet we have this estate agency which clearly is not hospitable, and that cannot be unintentional, and of course isn't, because we see then in the poem here, and I was thinking of the old gods, Ava, and ships they sank without notice.
Extraordinary, that microcosm of the coffee, the waves becoming like something out of Clash of the Titans.
Yeah, absolutely.
They do seem to be the indifferent Homeric gods there. Pinging Odysseus from port to port away from his final destination. And I think there is a sense that the dreamed of home is a destination that this tenant will maybe never reach, constantly diverted and sent on digressions. But then, the Homeric thread comes back towards the end of the extract, doesn't it, with the phone that rings like a siren. And I mean, speaking of sirens, there is something quite flirtatious about the tone. There's an awful lot of innuendo, isn't there, in the digger passage? But the thrush and the pox on both our crotches, that's a plague on both our houses, Romeo and Juliet. Yes. Well, actually, that's just before Mercutio's already been fatally stabbed in the brawl at that point, hasn't he? So he's about to make his pun about a grave man, and there is something rather grave-like and deathly in everything that follows from that point, isn't there?
Yeah, I just feel like Ava's not getting any of the intertextual references there. She's just deleted the email without fully appreciating how literary it is. And I think that is kind of really one of the wonderful ways in which this book and this poem really gives a lot to us. That somehow the new question and the new forms of technology through which money and kind of rental capacity is being mediated are also age-old human questions. And so you can only change it so much. You can only make it as artificial as, is being made here. And yet still we have this need for a place to live. We have a need for belonging. We have a need for home in whatever form, or a succession of houses, or indeed a pox.
And I wonder if there is some sort of nod to that old superstition in folklore of burying a living thing, or immuring, I think is the right term, a living thing, like a sort of sacrifice in the completed walls of a house or a building to ward off bad luck, and the evil eye, and so on. But we have the ultra-rich doing it here with their diggers in their mega basements, so constrained by planning. They can't go up, but they can go down, potentially.
Are these apocalypse bunkers?
Well, I mean, by the time you get 6 floors down, maybe they are. But it also seems to be something about the proletariat labour being literally buried and ensconced beneath these abominations of 16-storey terraces in Chelsea or whatever they are.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth, just kind of meditating on the fact that this is a really serious and increasing crisis of housing that Frears is really clearly writing about something that many, many people experience. There's an interesting article that comes from the issue, actually just, recent issue that came out in May of the London Review of Books. It is an article by Jack Schenker called Rent versus Rentiers. And he lays out with kind of really brutal detail just how awful this is and how much worse it is getting. And he writes, today HMRC estimates that there are 2.8 million landlords in the UK, more than 5% of the adult population. That's twice as many landlords as NHS employees, 4 times the number of teachers, double the number of coal miners at the industry's peak. Landlordism is rife. It's everywhere. And it is possibly getting worse. And as it gets worse, tenants' safety is going to diminish. And that seems to be something that the government's successive governments have potentially tried to ameliorate, but it hasn't really been the case. And Schenker says also that the UK's homelessness crisis is now the worst in the developed world, which I was surprised really to hear that, but is quite shocking.
Well, I wonder if that coffee, though it's in a mug here, is a sort of nod to the way the right-wing press pillories Generation Rent, so-called, for getting too many takeout coffees and plates of avocado toast, and this is why they can't afford their deposit on their houses. But I think basements become an important motif here. There's reference already at this opening to Ava picturing me in this little flat you rent us. But the cumulative, accumulating nature of this digressive stream of consciousness work is that motifs recur, leitmotifs, I suppose, and basements is one of them. So soon after this, the speaker has a sort of recollection of a childhood fever dream where she imagines the voice of a doctor speaking to her from the basement of the big house. This reverie, imagining the ideal home with its polished concrete floors and done-up kitchen that she will never possess. But I think the basement becomes a sort of unconscious where traumatic memories resurface from.
Yes.
And then she goes and lives in a basement flat, which is incredibly grim vision. She says, I couldn't find the stairs or door. In horror films, the basement is where the monsters are. I lived in someone's basement for about a year. Corridors so narrow that my shoulders touched both walls as I walked down. My bedroom had no window, a sort of breeze block coffin just bigger than a double bed.
Again, sort of, death, the entombment, the kind of the grave is being invoked as a kind of consequence of a financial system where one cannot get a foothold, where one feels that they can't get a grip and are ultimately kind of buried.
But it also casts the bed, which we get in the extract we heard in A New Light, doesn't it? That she's lying in bed writing this email, lazy you might think, but that's in you like when you think that these properties and their rooms might be so small that they barely fit the bed in, let alone space around. And I think the erotic flirtation that you get with the digger and the basement entombment in this first passage is cast in a rather horrific new light when you see the student tenant doing an early job in a pub, and she ends up being lured downstairs into the basement by this mean, horrific boss who ends up probably raping her down there, though it's quite darkened and bleak what exactly happens. But the lines just before that episode, no cameras in the basement, just one way out. I didn't stand a chance. And so the flirtation is counterbalanced by these repeated episodes of sexual predation and violence, and violation that you get sort of cheerfully recounted through the course of Good Lord.
I guess,
so that precarity.
Yeah. And thinking about the kind of the Homeric there again, there's almost a kind of catabasis, isn't there, of kind of going down into this underworld, and indeed the kind of underbelly of a system again, where one has very, very limited power and is helpless and is a victim always.
The author of today's last poem, Denez Smith, has published 4 collections of poetry: Insert Boy, Don't Call Us Dead, Homie, and most recently Bluff. For their work, Denez has won numerous prizes, including the Forward Prize for Best Collection, and was recently a finalist for the Pulitzer. Denez lives in the Twin Cities and teaches at the Randolph College MFA program. So the poem we'll be looking at now comes from Denez's 3rd collection, Homie, published by Chatto in the UK in 2020. The book as a whole is an anthem to friendship and community, a sort of celebration of family, but also chosen kinship. But this poem, Cream, is a sort of sharp, satirical, scathing even exploration of how race, poverty, and systematic oppression intersect and are lived by people like the speaker as day-to-day financial anxiety. The title borrows from the famous hook and title of the 1993 Wu-Tang Clan hit single, Cream. This acronym stands for Cash Rules Everything Around Me. Smith turns it towards a critique of capitalism and white supremacy as versions of one another.
Cream, after Wu-Tang, after Morgan Parker. In the morning I think about money, green-horned lord of my waking, forest in which I stumble toward no salvation, prison of emerald and pennies. In my wallet I keep anxiety and a condom. I used to sell my body, but now my blood's spoiled. All my favorite songs warn me to get money. I'd rob a bank, but I'm a poet. I'm so broke, I'm a genius. If I was white, I'd take pictures of other pictures and sell them for 6 figures. Happened. I come from sharecroppers who come from slaves who do not come from kings. Sometimes I pay the weed man before I pay the light bill. Sometimes is a synonym for often. I just want a rich white sugar daddy and I'll be straight. I feel most colored when I'm looking at my bank account. When I scream, ball so hard motherfuckers want to find me. Sally Mae a motherfucker. I spent one summer stealing from 3 different rag stocks. Always bought a ring. If I went to jail, I'd live rent-free, but there's no way to avoid making white people richer. A prison is a plantation made of stone and steel. Being locked up for selling drugs is equal to being locked up for trying to feed your loves. I used to help him bag it up. A ball fade costs 20 bones nowadays. My grandma is great at saving money. What's a blacker tax than blackness? Before my grandfather passed, he showed me where he hid his money and his gun. What costs more than being poor? My aunt can't hold on to $1, a job, her mind. How much the Powerball this week? I'ma print my own money and be my own god and live forever in a green frame. I was warm within my mother's broke. Don't ask me about my taxes. The B in debt is a silent black, trapped.
It's a very powerful poem and like a lot of Denez's work, brings together so many, really a kind of intersection of so many different concerns. I suppose thinking about kind of intimacy, thinking about families, you say kinship was something that you mentioned as well. But in terms of money, money feels quite bad, quite negative here. I mean, perhaps in the most direct way than I think we have seen in the other poems we've talked about.
And a dominating obsession when one doesn't have enough of it.
Yes, quite so.
Or maybe even when one does.
And then the sort of I guess the idea of cream, but then standing in for something else. I mean, I guess one wonders then, what is cream if it isn't standing for something else? Is this the...
Well, yeah, I guess as we were talking about the metaphorics of gravy, there is a whole field around cream here. I don't know, creme de la creme and the luxury on top of the milk, skimmed off perhaps.
Indeed, someone who's creaming off the profits, right? And the person who creams off the profits is clearly the wealthiest one here, and everyone else has to make do with whatever is left. And so there's a great deal of thinking, I guess, around inequality and the references there to kind of improbable ways of making money. I was very struck by the pictures of the pictures. What is all that about?
A little bit of sleuthing suggests to me that that's probably a nod to Richard Prince, the famous but not to me appropriation artist who, as an exercise in sort of conceptual Duchamp, well, maybe more Warhol-like actually as an exercise. He took screenshots of other people's Instagram posts without permission, blew them up into big canvases and sold them for $100,000 each at the Frieze Art Fair. Wow. So art thinking about appropriation, use without permission, but also, I don't know, the closed circuit of artwork that never really had an aura in the first place, but endlessly recirculates our capital, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there, isn't there? I mean, even just thinking about the term appropriation and the ways in which conceptual poets and conceptual artists appropriate with reference to race specifically, and this is something that is possibly in Danez Smith's thinking, that one appropriates in that example of taking a photo of a photo. One is not just appropriating the form, which in itself, it doesn't belong to any of us. I don't think Instagram belongs to any of us, but also that it's appropriating the experience that is therein. And there are many examples of conceptual poets who are using forms of appropriation in ways that contravene certain, I suppose, rules to do with the ways in which we feel about speaking for others, and particularly racialized experiences. So that is there as well. But also, indeed, as you say, this sense of like, why would you pay six figures for something that isn't authentic or original? And this goes straight back to money and thinking about, what is money worth? How does money stand in for something else? How do we decide the value of something? No one is going to pay six figures for a poem, presumably, unless, well, maybe they do. I can't think of any examples of that.
I mean, speaking of hard ways of making money and surviving, I guess there are quite a few here, aren't there, including sex work. So I used to sell my body, but now my blood's spoiled. Yeah. A reference to perhaps to Smith's own HIV diagnosis. Yeah. But sex work, I think, is present in the other two poets we looked at. So that the reference to the beggar woman reading Lolita in the Seidel does make you think of her vulnerability to predation, I think. But also in the next door flat to Ella Frears' basement in Good Lord, the upstairs neighbour calls it a brothel. She doesn't settle the question on that, but it's certainly women and children living down in that basement. And so this idea of sex work as a really impactful emblem of capitalism's extraction and exploitation of people.
And it is a truly global market in the most awful way, and of course extremely exploitative. So yes, how does the poet then become like a sex worker is an interesting question. Why is a fascination with kind of use or being, instrumentalized in that particular way for the pleasure or desires of others is a question probably that somewhat exceeds our conversation, but it was an interesting one that I think is posited by the poem. We also have the fascinating line, if I went to jail, I'd live rent-free, but there was no way to avoid making white people richer. A prison is a plantation made of stone and steel. A reference there to another form of kind of extractive and exploitative, an offshoot, I guess, of capitalism in the prison industrial complex.
Yeah, that prisons are profitable enterprises that continue racial exploitation under different legal structures. Yeah, I think these two examples speak back to the intertext that Smith references in the afters here, after Morgan Parker, after Wu-Tang. So in Morgan Parker's poem, "All they want is my money, my pussy, my blood," it's not sort of pinned down, but there is this sense of sexual exploitation. "I'm so hungry I could get it on," goes one line in that poem. And then in the Wu-Tang song, you have this portrait of young black men growing up, struggling to get by in the inner city selling drugs. There's a glimpse of that in Danez's poem too. But then he's sent to prison, and you see him in the prison van going off to the to the plantation made of stone and steel.
And in all
Smith calls
cases, whether it's sex work or whether it's, those are kind of being sent to prison in these forms of these ways, or the poor. I mean, these are already people who are without agency and without privilege and without money and without capital. And it is, of course, this widening inequality that actually one doesn't get a foothold in the system, particularly if one is poor, one is a woman, one is queer, or one is black, et cetera. That actually these things just kind of are insurmountable. And the reference to sharecropping, I guess, is another way that we could think that come from sharecroppers who come from slaves who do not come from kings is a very poignant line and does point us directly to the ways in which debt is inherited. I mean, obviously in the form of enslavement, one sees how slavery kind of ends and then turns into something else.
In post-Civil War America, yeah.
Exactly. And the ways in which power and control over this agrarian industry is maintained through sharecropping. And so as much as you think you can kind of make on a particular, the use of a particular plot of land, you're always going to be in debt. You're never going to get to the point where you are the agent of your own production or you can have any sort of personal profit. So you're in a cycle of debt.
Yeah, that sort of trajectory from slavery to sharecroppers to now is this sort of compressed genealogy of how oppression doesn't disappear but just changes from one form to another, isn't it?
I mean, Pound would probably agree with this, wouldn't he? And it's interesting that, like, in some ways that these sorts of ideas do still connect to a kind of glorification of agrarianism, and the distrust of financial centers, which inevitably in America become the North or kind of New England or, D.C., et cetera. The centers of political power are not in the agrarian South. And but in a way that actually is the place where these kinds of inequalities are going unremediated, and that's to do with this kind of production economy related to and descending from the plantation.
Well, yeah, I think Smith is very clear-eyed about that, isn't he? I mean, the reference to "we do not come from kings," I guess that's alluding to the sort of certain movements for reclaiming African heritage and looking rather skeptically at them, though I think that phrase "we were kings" turns into a racist meme on 4chan and so on. But it's complicated, but I think they're saying there's no glory to the ancestry here, that agrarian dream that's part of the American dream is a mirage, that all you have is slavery and exploitation under different guises.
At certain points, the poem becomes almost aphoristic as well, which is interesting. Again, thinking about Steve.
Yeah, that's from the Morgan Parker again, which also takes the form of this series of one-liners delivered quite deadpan. But yeah, I think it does reach back to Stevens and the coinage, the aphorism. Yeah.
Yeah. Although in Stevens' case, these things are not being performed; they're being accumulated in a kind of notebook fashion over time. Whereas with Morgan Parker and Danez's work, these are poems that are performed, and there is there's an interesting connection between those things to be made. But I suppose that the one-liner becomes a way to land an effect on an audience. And what unites the aphorism and the kind of performance line is this desire for truth. And for kind of concision in a particular kind of, a kind of almost a kind of coin or kernel of knowledge. But the "I'd rob a bank, but I'm a poet. I'm so broke, I'm a genius." It's like that, I'm so clever, I have my mouth sewn shut kind of line. But it feels kind of paradoxical in some ways, but actually, is it a kind of sense? Is it a kind of truth? Do poets rob banks? I don't know. Do poets rob banks? I feel like we should know this.
Well, I think it's a joke about how we're not practical enough to do anything.
Something for future generations to aspire to then. Sally May, do we need to sort of think a bit about that? Because if Sally May goes back to the Morgan Parker again, doesn't it?
Where there's also, I just want my student loans to disappear is a line in the Parker too.
Yeah.
So yes, I guess these structures, Sally May is the student loan company, originally a public entity, but then privatized, isn't it? So
that's all good things, yes.
Yeah, even the education as a route out of certain kinds of poverty and disadvantage becomes rather complicated when it binds you to a debt that you can maybe never hope to clear.
In many cases, never repay. Although I think Biden did clear some student loan debt. But indeed, it's and of course the cost of education, particularly in the US, is astronomical. And if one is paying for an MFA in poetry, the chances of you paying it back with poetry are slim.
Makes me think of the amazing last line here, perhaps the most aphoristic of all of them. The bee in debt is a silent black trapped.
Yeah.
What's happening there?
I mean, I suppose the B and the D there in debt, and there's a B and a D kind of appear throughout the poem, or maybe you just notice it because of the play there. But it's the inverse. It is the kind of it's the same thing, but in the opposite direction. Yeah. They're mirroring exactly, and so I guess the fact that the B is not pronounced is that it's always there. It's always kind of waiting.
It's like a silent history.
Yeah.
Racialized. Yeah.
Yes, indeed, exactly.
So yeah, like racial violence enclosed in ostensibly neutral economic systems. There's an earlier draft of this poem published online in a magazine on poets.org where that line is the bee in debt is a silent black boy trapped. And Deleuze has spoken interestingly in interviews, including with you, Sandeep, about the resonance of that word boy, though I guess they decide to leave the black ungendered. Well, and indeed, without a capital letter, it might be a darkness. It's not necessarily a person. It can be both in the way that they revise the line to the silent black trapped. There's a void there as well as a trapped person, immured in debt.
Yeah, boy means different things when Dennis Smith uses it across the various books. There's boy, which is BOI, which is a kind of more colloquial kind of kin reference, which feels like a kind of beloved, I guess, which is another term that I think quite a few poets of that generation use. But then to have boy with a Y has very kind of hugely resonant kind of racial implications in the way that there is an inherent hierarchy of power and the address of boy by white people to black men and the sense of the emasculation therein and that historical emasculation that comes from enslavement and its terrible history. So I think in this case, the removal of boy as a double sort of sonically at least, a kind of two-sided thing, focuses our attention on black and opens it out in different ways, I think.
There are some interesting changes between the earlier and the book published version of this poem. One that intrigued me a lot is a line that's cut that goes, I don't know what it says about me when white institutions give me money. And there's also a reference to grants and fellowships that gets cut too.
Yes.
So it's as if Smith isn't quite ready at the point of publishing Homie to expose themselves and their own complicity in the system in that way. Maybe.
Well, I guess it becomes very obvious at that point if one is saying that publicly. It's quite easy to see what big awards and fellowships and prize money one has received. And in many cases, it's a bigger subject perhaps than kind of what is being addressed here, and also a very different, it's a shift away, because there is a historical sense of money as this oppressive force and this oppressive racial force throughout the poem, which makes some use of the poet as a figure, but then the aspect of complicity and the complexities of that complicity are then dealt with later.
Yes, it becomes a major theme of their next book, their fourth collection, Bluff, which came out in 2024.
Well, and I suppose it makes sense why. I mean, in many ways, and particularly, Don't Call Us Dead, was a book that I think kind of found its moment, particularly with Black Lives Matter, and Danez Smith became a kind of very interesting, kind of spokesperson for a particular kind of sort of unbelievable violence, and also a direct pointing to whiteness, which I always admired very much. In fact, I saw them read, I think it might have been in the Ellerby bookshop. I'm possibly misremembering this, and I think Danez Smith does this in lots of readings, and kind of said something like, the book is about American racism, but you all invented racism, and the British audience is sort of like, I'm sure taking it on the chin, but also thinking, well, that's historically, accurate, the taxonomy of race and everything else, and imperialism, that one could say this. And these are things that are all bound up in money and extraction and exploitation.
So I think that there's a reference to those incredible poems, different ways of elegizing killed black boys and men in Don't Call Us Dead, in this poem Less Hope from Bluff, which has these lines: I took the awards and cashed the checks. I did the one about the boy when requested, traded their names for followers. In lieu of action, I wrote a book, edited my war cries down to prayers, oh devil. And I guess that devil is another incarnation of that greenhorn lord of my waking in this poem, isn't it? The devil,
money becomes the devil. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even...
And the muzzle,
and it's really heartbreaking trading the names and being kind of commissioned to write about the dead for followers. And in a sense, there is that thing, isn't there, on, I guess there is that thing with social media, you can monetize your following. When did friends turn into monetized followers? It's kind of extraordinary how these affective relationships, these communities, in fact, even people believe these are kind of communities, become these ways of of shoring up one's financial security. And, war cries, sometimes I almost hear war crimes in there. There's something really kind of fascinating. In lieu of action, it just feels like almost a kind of martial metaphor there. And it really does make us think, what are the possible outcomes for speaking this kind of truth? What is the hope of these kinds of social justice poems? How does one become exploited at the same time, and to assuage the guilt of institutions and culture and people who have the power?
Well, as that line says, there is no way to avoid making white people richer in the publishing industrial complex, I suppose. But this dynamic facing black anti-establishment writers in particular, it reminds me of that poem Benjamin Zephaniah published in the wake of refusing his OBE in this country. It was called Bought and Sold. Here are a few lines from across it. Smart big awards and prize money is killing off black poetry. The ancestors would turn in graves. Those poor black folk that once were slaves would wonder how our souls were sold and check our strategies. The empire strikes back and waves. Tamed warriors bow on parades. When they have done what they've been told, they get their OBEs. You look like a dreadlocks rasta, you look like a ghetto blaster, but you can't diss your paymaster and bite the hand that feeds you.
I mean, absolutely. I think there's very little to disagree with there, is there? That very direct pointing, and you're absolutely right. That is what Danez Smith is kind of getting at. Is, I mean, I guess one almost wants to say, okay, what about the inverse? How can poets survive if they're black poets, or they're poets from any kind of oppressed or marginalized minority, or not even minority, just group? Where is the complex line that one treads between being a part of the establishment, or being recognized and rewarded by the establishment, and staying true to a kind of experience, or not commodifying it? I mean, this is an age-old question, isn't it? So I guess our kind of takeaway points for today, really thinking across today's poems, we've seen how poets turn to money as a motif that lets them raise questions about value, inequality, social justice, within an art form that resists, or likes to think of itself anyway, as resisting a sort of form of easy commodification. This is our last studio episode of this series of Poetry and the Turning World. Thank you all so much for listening.
If you've enjoyed our conversation about poetry today, perhaps you'd consider subscribing to the Close Readings podcast. Mark Ford and Seamus Perry have various wonderful series on poetry there that you might enjoy. And listeners can get 25% off by using the code Poetry25. You'll find a link in the description.